Well, I've been looking forward to this primarily because I've just been doing a lot of administrative stuff that's not very taxing on my brain, but also because um, there are just so many questions around the historical Paul that we just got into the last time we were together. And I think we mentioned, that what we know about Paul comes from two different sources. Uh, we have the writings of Paul himself. But if those writing, basically, as Crossan and Borg say, when we read Paul's letters, we're reading somebody else's mail. But it's a great way to begin to teach students about, the historical critical method. Just by the form of what we're reading, it's a different form than what we find in the narratives of Jesus. Paul is writing to a particular audience for a particular purpose, and in a particular decade with very very specific questions that are being answered. So there's a lot about that we can tell about the issues that were going on in the context of the recipients. So you might remember that Paul writes his letter somewhere between 48 and 58 to 60 of the Common Era. Several decades later, probably as late as 100, but as early as 90, we get a different type of narrative from a purported companion of Paul. Of course, there's one person named Luke in one of Paul's letters, but I can't remember which one it is. But it appears that Luke, who wrote the gospel, we're pretty certain that Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke, wrote the gospel as a first part of a longer history of the early church. And so the second part of the Gospel of Luke, what scholars refer to as the Acts of the Apostles, really is the second half of a larger corpus called Luke Acts. This is what scholars refer to it as. And that was written well after the fact, probably even after Paul's death. Not probably, it was certainly written after Paul's death. So we have that text to go on. But when we read those texts, those two different sources very carefully, what we see is there's some discrepancy. And I'd really like to talk about one of these discrepancies today. First of those discrepancies has to do with, just Paul's, the narrative of his life, his conversion and then his first missionary journey. And we got to this point last time where we were talking about when this missionary journey took place. Most scholars will say somewhere between 46 and 50 of the Common Era is when, Paul begins his missionary journey. But then Paul had a conversion probably somewhere as early as 2 to 3 years after the death of Jesus, to maybe, somewhere between 34 and 39. We don't know exactly where it is. But when we read in Acts 11 and 12, as we did last time, some questions are raised about the timeline of Paul and his life. And so today, before we get into Crossan and Borg's book, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that that we're dealing with. And one of those really there's a historical aspect to it that involves a lot of mythologizing not only in terms of Luke writing about who Paul is. When I say mythology, I mean, I'm not talking about somebody writing a story that never happened, but somebody writing a story that has some universal themes in it. Luke is certainly trying to write an apologetic history of Paul and his missionary journeys. And we see themes coming up again and again that we will certainly talk about. But one of those has to do with Paul's conversion. And I want to read for you 3 different stories of Paul's conversion from the mouth of Paul himself in 2 of the cases, and then talk a little bit about what we hear and what we see and what we don't see in these. So let's assume a late death of Christ. Our dating of historical events is going to be very, very shoddy. If we could even narrow it down to within 5 years, it's very difficult. But one thing that's nice about Luke and his writing of the Acts of the Apostles, he names historical figures. In Acts 26, King Agrippa is named, and we have a certain date for his death, which was somewhere around 60 of the Common Era, if I'm remembering correctly. So if Paul appears before Agrippa, who is this historical figure, who is confirmed as a historical figure by outside sources, then we can kind of get a sense of, when Paul was living. But there's also some fanciful embellishments of stories that are happening with Luke, as well as after Luke. And I really want to focus on the after Luke part of this, because maybe you can help me understand something that I don't quite understand. So let's assume that Jesus dies somewhere between 29 at the earliest and 33 at the latest, at the hands of the Romans in Jerusalem, on a hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull. Shortly after that, the apostles begin their ministry. We know the Pentecost story of the Spirit coming down. They begin speaking in other languages. And then this story is all told in the first 8 chapters of the Acts of the Apostles. But it's during one of these stories, the stoning of Stephen, that 2 things happen. One of those things is that Paul is introduced as a persecutor of the followers of the way. This is what the Christian church was being referred to at the time, the way of Christ. Not clear that they saw themselves as doing anything different from Judaism, but simply proclaiming Jesus as the Jewish Messiah to those in Jerusalem who would listen. But the other thing that happens, and this is in chapter 7 of Acts, is that in the stoning of Stephen, now think of Luke writing this between 90 and 100 of the Common Era and what he's trying to do in terms of who he's trying to write to. There is a man by the name of Stephen, who's a Gentile. We know this because any name, well, Stephen is a Greek name, it's not a Hebrew name. Any name that has a PH in it, that's usually a good indicator that that is a Greek name, because of the Greek letter phi, as we know, as it's pronounced when it's written. Phi is part of the Greek alphabet. So Stephen, as he's preaching, he gives a complete overview of what we might call salvation history. And this overview of salvation history is going to be repeated again and again in Acts. It first comes from the mouth of Stephen, how God chooses the people of Israel, gives them the law so that they can be a people blessed and set aside, and they can be a blessing to the world. The prophets come and try to keep them within the narrow bounds of the law to be righteous before God, but they kill the prophets. And finally, they kill Jesus, who is the Messiah. And then Stephen points his finger, and it was you Jews who did this. And then naturally, you know what happens. Stephen is taken out and he's stoned. He's killed in a very brutal way, a stoning outside. And this takes place, we presume, in Jerusalem. And of course, and it's in this where Stephen looks up and he sees this image of God sitting at the right, or of Jesus sitting at the right hand of God. It's doubtful that event happened in the way that we read it, but it nevertheless fulfills a narrative function. It introduces Gentiles as people who can understand and preach the gospel. It also gives this whole scenario of salvation history into which Jesus is placed as the central pivotal figure. And it also introduces Paul. Now, why do we think that this didn't happen? Jews didn't have the authority to stone somebody in Jerusalem. Remember, they just didn't take Jesus out and stone him, right? When they knew that he was being tried for blasphemy. And that, according to the Hebrew Bible, was a sin, a digression from the law that was punishable by stoning. Well, we know in the narrative of the Gospels that the high priests and the Sanhedrin had to run this gauntlet of, hey, we got to take him to the Romans so that the Romans will kill him for us, because we don't have that ability. Well, then all of a sudden in Acts, we see the story where Stephen, who is being charged with the same with the same act of being blasphemous to God, is just simply stoned forthwith. No trial, no nothing. And he's not even a Jew, right? He's a Gentile who has begun to follow the way of Jesus. Now, me saying he's not a Jew has some particular difficulties that I won't go into. So the real function of the story is not as this historical event that happened, but to introduce the salvation history that Paul is going to preach after we are introduced to him. But it is at this stoning that Paul is holding the cloaks of the people stoning, right? They needed to have their arms free so they could, give their best shot. And Paul was there, and he does not object to it. And then soon we know that Paul becomes a persecutor. And I should speak more accurately. At this point, he is called Saul, which is his Hebrew name. So let me stop and see if there are any questions about that so far.
Dan?
Yeah, Denny.
Just a question of historiography and method. How did Luke, 20, 30 years later, acquire the detailed information that appears in the book of Acts? I'm trying to make that connection between what the gospel writers knew about Paul.
Right. It's evident. Well, in the next book I would like to read, if you will allow me that, it's evident that Paul really influenced the gospel writers. There is a person that Paul travels through Asia Minor with named Mark. And of course, that's a common name, right? But it has been suggested that this was the Mark who wrote the gospel, the Gospel of Mark. In the Acts of the Apostles, there is a place when Paul is in Troas, I believe it, and he hears a voice of someone, or he has a vision of someone saying, "Come over to Macedonia." And the narrative goes from the third person, and he and his companions, to the first person, and we went. So the suggestion there is that this is the place where Luke picks up with the missionary journeys of Paul, and that he was part of Paul's entourage, if you want to call it, thereafter. And so he would have had possibly a firsthand knowledge. But then there's the other possibility, Denny, and that this is all very, very much an apologetic history that really has only the slightest foothold in history, right? We know that Paul established these churches, and we can kind of get a sense of when they were established by reading his letters. Maybe Luke had those sources in front of him and was able to piece together from accounts of people who knew Paul this history. But it's very difficult to know, what his source material is. We just don't know. But he didn't do a very good job in terms of historiography as we understand it in the 19th and 20th century. Case in point, the story of Paul's conversion. We know that Paul goes to the high priest and gets letters to take up to Damascus saying, hey, look out for these ne'er-do-wells, these so-called, they weren't called Christians yet, but the followers of the way of Jesus. And so the story is told 3 different times in Acts. And I just want to read the basics of the story and pose some questions to you. And I hope you find this interesting, because I certainly did. So Acts chapter 9, this is after the stoning of Stephen, and Paul is, just breathing threats and murder, as it says in Acts chapter 9. Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. This bringing them bound to Jerusalem appears in a later narrative as well. Now, as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? He asked, who are you, Lord? And the reply came, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do. The men, and here's the important one, the men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice, but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by hand and brought him into Damascus. All right, so there's some details there that are kind of interesting. Paul sees a bright light and he hears a voice. And in this story, the men heard the voice, but they didn't see the light. That's going to change significantly when we get to chapter 22. And let me read this. And this is Paul before the tribune or the tribunal. I can't remember. But he's been arrested in Jerusalem for causing a ruckus, and he has proclaimed, hey, I'm a Roman citizen. I deserve to be heard. And then finally, he's going to go all the way up to the emperor to plead his case. But as he's doing it, he has the opportunity to tell his story again and the reason for why he's doing what he's doing. And part of this story includes this conversion experience. And here's how he says it in front of the tribune in Jerusalem. While I was on my way and approaching Damascus, about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone about me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, who are you, Lord? Then he said to me, I'm Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now, those who were with me saw the light, but they did not hear the voice of the one who was speaking to me. I asked, what am I to do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, get up and go to Damascus. There you will be told everything that has been assigned to you. And since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, those who were with me took my hand and led me to Damascus. So now we have a slight change, right? In one story, the people see the light, but they don't hear the voice. In this story, what if I'm getting it? Maybe I'm getting it mixed up. Well, they see the light, don't hear the voice, or they don't see the light and hear the voice. So, and then they fall to the ground and they lead Paul by the hand into Damascus. Then finally, when he's in front of King Agrippa, there's another telling of the tale. And this one is a little bit more elaborate and contains more theology behind it, because he's trying to explain to Agrippa, who ostensibly is a Jew, just why it is that he's on this missionary journey. So let me read this one, okay? I was traveling to Damascus with the authority and commission of the chief priests, when at midday along the road, Your Excellency, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining around me and my companions. When we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It hurts you to kick against the goads. That's what the voice is saying. Now, that's in addition to what we just heard. It hurts you to kick against the goads. I asked, who are you, Lord? And the Lord answered, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But get up and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you to serve and testify to the things in which you have seen me, and to those in which I will appear to you. I will rescue you from your people and from the Gentiles to whom I am sending you, to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God. And then he's led again into Damascus by hand. Now, what I find so interesting about this, well, first of all, let me stop and see if any of you, why is Luke telling the story 3 times? And then B, what do we do? And especially for our fundamentalist friends, what do we do with this discrepancy, which they will smooth over and say, oh, it doesn't matter. In one of these, Paul sees the light, but the others hear the voice. They don't see the light, which suggests both of these experiences include 2 sensual aspects, right? Hearing and seeing. One, they see the light, they don't hear the voice. And the other, they hear, or they do see the light, but don't hear the voice. Or is that what I just said? What do you suppose is going on here? It's kind of a complex question. I wonder if there was, in later interpretations, this understanding of, well, Paul just had this mystical journey or this mystical experience that nobody else had. He saw a light and he heard a voice, and this was completely unknown to everybody else, right? But it was a calling specifically of Paul, right? Of Saul, I should say. So on the one hand, we want to make sure that we recognize that Saul himself is being called through this experience. But it's not just a crazy guy out there, who's got this, this inner voice and inner light that he's responding to. Other people outside are part of it, and they can attest to it. I'm wondering if what we're reading is, an embellishment by Luke that was caused by people making the accusation that Paul just had a crazy psychotic experience and then had absolutely nothing to do with Christianity, and we're going to be following a crazy man. You don't want to say, oh, it's an experience that everybody had, but at the same time, you don't want to say it's an experience that only Paul had on the road to Damascus. So they kind of split the difference. They hear the voice, but don't see the light, or they see the light and don't hear the voice. I don't know. That's the only way I can possibly explain that from a historical critical perspective. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, and I hope I haven't muddied the waters in what I just told you. But it's a discrepancy that has to be in some way explained, right? Any thoughts?
I guess I think, that's a plausible explanation. And again, these all three are in Luke.
Yeah.
And, so it's late.
Yeah.
But, it fits into his narrative that, Paul is the one who's spreading the word.
Yeah.
And so he's unique in that sense, that the revelation that he's had that wasn't shared by anybody else. And it's his job to go out and proselytize.
Yeah.
So I guess, it makes sense to me as much as any other theory.
Yeah, right. And this is just my theory. In fact, I'm just came up with it even as I'm talking here, because the real thing I wanted to talk about was something else that is a part of mythology, not the mythologizing that Luke is doing, but the mythologizing that we have done in the Christian West. Look at these images of the story that we just read. Here's Saul having been thrown from his horse, seeing a great light, hearing a voice. I don't know, I can't remember who the artist is. The most famous of these images comes from, darn it, I can't move my, Caravaggio here on the left. Saul thrown from his horse, lying on his back, and then a later version, no doubt influenced by Caravaggio, by an Italian named Reni. Again, the light from heaven coming, and But here's the question: did we read about a horse? I don't remember. I went over this text again and again and again. I saw absolutely no reference to a horse. So, in the 16th, late 16th and early 17th centuries, when these paintings were being painted, I would love to know when this imagery of the horse comes into the story, comes into the narrative. And maybe I'm overlooking a place elsewhere in the letters of Paul where he talks about being thrown from a horse. But it wasn't in the stories. All of the people fall on the ground, and it goes to great pains to say, get up, stand on your feet, and be led back into Damascus. Why the horse? Let me hear what some of your thoughts are, if any.
Dan, I was thinking that the horse corroborates the experience. A horse who's not a thinking kind of being, but a sensory being.
Yeah.
Is also reacting.
Yeah. Good point. And the horses are all, as you say, well, except in Caravaggio, darn it, where am I going here? And the horse is looking this way, and the Reni, and this in Caravaggio, it was so good. The horse is just like, yeah, whatever. Is there any grass for me to eat on the ground? You have Paul's companion taking him, and Paul, obviously having this experience. Let me tell you what. Any other thoughts before I go on and blather on here?
It seems to me the horse might have some kind of symbolic meaning for Caravaggio. If you look at the trunk of the horse, what's with the spotted blanket, and it looks like leathers coming off the reins.
Yeah.
I
have no idea. I don't know. But where the horse comes from is an interesting question. And here's what I think is going on, because up until very recently, I had always thought that Saul, when he had this experience, was on a horse. Doesn't make sense in context, because horses were used primarily by the Roman army. It would be very, unlikely that Saul would have had access to a horse. They were not, they were war instruments, right? They were, if you wanted your common day, beast of burden, you were looking at a burro, a donkey, right? That's what Jesus rode into Jerusalem on, the lowly donkey, and they had better footing, everything. If Paul was traveling at all on an animal, it would have been that. But the horse also represents a kind of an imperial aspect to the story, right? Paul, in this case, is almost presented as a knight. And we know Paul talks about putting on the armor of righteousness and faith and things along those lines. But I'm wondering, I would love to know when in the historical representation of this event, the horse was introduced. And I'm going to guess it was at about the time of the Reformation or the Counter-Reformation, where the authority of Paul on the part of whoever is trying to create the authoritative narrative, where the authority of Paul is being bolstered by his association with this regal animal. He's the knight of the faith. He's the person who is connected with this animal of strength and power. I don't know, but I do know that I have long read that story. And even though it never says there's a horse involved, I've thought of a horse. Paul was thrown from his horse. And this is just the way that art has come to mythologize Paul himself. It's not in the text, not in the text at all. So anyway, any thoughts on that before I move on? Well, last time we were trying to figure out what happened, I wanted to put together a timeline of Paul's, after Saul's conversion. And it really amounts to this. He's converted, he goes to Damascus, and there he's baptized by Ananias. And then it appears he takes a mission to Arabia. And those were those images that we looked at last time in the city of Petra. Is not successful there, comes back to Damascus, begins preaching, and that's when he has his basket adventure where he's let down from the walls of the city. He goes and he meets, as we find in Galatians chapter 1, he goes and meets with disciples in Jerusalem, and then is sent. And it actually just meets with Peter and James. And then, because people are trying to kill him, he's sent to Tarsus. And there it looks as if he spends 14, and some scholars, as I was reading on this, some scholars say this was a misprint, that it's really supposed to be 4 years that he's there in Tarsus. And then, as it says in Acts chapter 11, verse 26, Barnabas goes to Tarsus, retrieves him. Saul returns to Antioch, and then begins his first missionary journey. What was part of the reason? We know that Paul, on his missionary journeys, was taking up collections for the church in Jerusalem. And, all of this was focused on Jerusalem. And what was the reason behind that? Was it because they just needed money the way churches need money? No, there was a famine in Judea sometime around 44 of the Common Era. It's likely that Paul taking up the collection for the people in Jerusalem was in connection with, this famine. The church always doing its best to try to feed people, as we know so well, right? Well, we do know that famine began in 44 of the Common Era. So it looks like that would have been about the time that Paul would have started his missionary journey. And so his first missionary journey begins probably somewhere between 46 and 50 during the famine. That is, here's another historical marker that we know that, outside sources have said that there was this famine. So that's where the story of Paul begins. But it doesn't appear that he could have spent 14 years in Tarsus, as the text says. So there's another conundrum that Luke does not quite get right. But one thing I do want to mention is that while he was in Tarsus, he would have come in contact. I mentioned this last time, if I can just get mine. He would have come in contact with, and I just saw it in here, excuse me, with a number of mystery cults. And I don't think these can be overlooked as we talk about Paul. In Tarsus, it would have been, in the first century, was pretty much the height of a cult by the name of the cult of Mithras. Not really sure where the story of Mithras comes from, but it is likely to have originated in the Zoroastrian, the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism. And you probably remember Zoroastrianism is this constant conflict between matters of darkness and light. And in that religion, Mithra was seen as a bringer of light to the world. Interestingly enough, born on December 25th, beneath a star. I'm talking about Mithra now, right? In the Zoroastrian religion. In first century Asia Minor, under the Roman Empire, there was a cult of Mithras that was very, very popular, that involved a number of things that we're going to see in the Christian religion as well. This one, not so much, but it was understood that Mithras was born from a rock. And there are various points in his life. In fact, there are 7 aspects of his life that are ritually reenacted in this cult. Members of the cult would meet underground in what are called Mithraeums, or basically caves, that had a particular altar and usually had the symbolic imagery of the universe with, the constellations of the world around them. And there would be basic initiations that took place. And these initiations were really reenactments of the life of Mithras himself. The first initiation would involve something around his being born from a rock. The one that is, I don't remember all 7 of them, but there are 2 that are really very interesting. One of them has to do with this mythic story of, it's called a Tauroctony, is the death, or excuse me, the capture of a bull by Mithras and the slaughter of this bull. Now, I've heard stories that in this cult, it may have been that the bull was brought out over a grate, and initiates would go under the bull itself. I'm talking about this, the Mithraic cult, and the animal would be slaughtered, and the blood would fall down upon the initiates, and that would be their baptism by blood. So being baptized in the blood of the animal that was slaughtered. In the cult, the bull represents evil and darkness, and Mithras representing light, and overcoming the bull. And you will see this image in many, many places, and it usually looks the same. You've got Mithras holding the bull's head back, plunging the knife into his neck. He's usually standing on the bull's right foot, just kind of trying to keep him stable. And he usually has 2 assistants on either side, not in this image. But then there are these 3 images that are 3 creatures that are available. You have a dog, you have a snake, and the one that I find interesting, right down here, if you look very closely, you see a scorpion who is attacking the genitals of the bull. Ouch. That seems very, very strange to me. But this was something that would have been enacted throughout Tarsus and throughout the Roman Empire in the first century. It was a common cult. Another scene from the life of Mithras that would have been enacted would have been the eating of this bull in the company of the god Sol, the god of the sun. And Mithras, of course, approaches the god, and the god bows down to him, and then they have this banquet meal. And this banquet meal would be carried out among the initiates as well. So we've got this baptism by blood. We've got the eating of the ceremonial meal being very, very important in this cult. Another cult that Paul would have been in contact with would have been that of Dionysus. And you probably know about Dionysus, who's the god of wine and merriment. And people would commune with this god through ritual drunkenness. It's where we get our term spirits, right? Our wine and spirits. The spirit of Dionysus would overtake you, and you would lose your inhibitions, and you would, be involved in this Dionysian bacchanalia. Also, Dionysus is also referred to as Bacchus, being possessed of the spirit. But in the midst of this, the people would come together and they would act out what was known as the goat song, which many have suggested was the beginning of Western theater. Kind of interesting. I'd like to look more into that. But all of this to say that Paul would have been surrounded after his conversion. Imagine he's sent to Tarsus and there spends however many years living in his parents' basement, the way kids do these days, surrounded by these mystery cults, thinking about this person, Jesus of Nazareth, whom he once persecuted, but now was being called to go and preach. And being the intellectual sort that he was, probably tried to make some sense of all of this. And in the context of these mystery religions, we have to ask the question, how much did these religious traditions, these mystery cults, influence the later theology that Paul preached in various churches around Asia Minor? I wanted to say that very briefly because I find it really fascinating. Paul is the earliest person that we know that is speaking about Jesus of Nazareth and his, mission as a Messiah and his role as a Messiah. And just wonder how much syncretism was going on. Well, last time we talked a little bit about his first missionary journey, and I wanted to just remind you, his first missionary journey was a very short one. His second missionary journey, he embarked from Jerusalem. And you can read about this in Acts chapter 16, 17, and 18. And you can see that this missionary journey is where he really touches the churches that we know so well, right? He goes from Jerusalem up to Antioch, takes a little rest there in Tarsus, then moves through the area generally known as Galatia right here. A lot of people will say, well, where's Galatia on the map? And they're looking for a city, but Galatia was really a general region known as Turkey today. So when Paul writes to the Galatians, he's writing to the churches that are in Galatia. Note that there is an Antioch in Galatia as well as an Antioch in Syria here. It's Antioch, Syria, where the followers of Jesus were first called Christians. He goes east, finds he preaches in Troas, and this is where he is called over to Macedonia, first to Philippi, and we know that he wrote a letter to the Philippians, a very heartfelt letter, then to Thessalonica, down to Berea, then to Athens, where he, really takes on the philosophers there, talking about an unknown God that they worship, and that's the God that he preaches. Spends time in Corinth, and then over to Ephesus. So we have Philippi, Thessalonica, Corinth, Ephesus, and these are all of the so-called authentic letters, except for the final letter that he writes from Rome itself. So you probably, if you've read the first chapter of the Crossan and Borg book, you know that the so-called the so-called radical Paul probably wrote the letters Philemon, Philippians, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, and 1st Thessalonians. And Crossan and Borg are going to say that those were, if not written during, but at least initiated from this second missionary journey. And that took a period of about 3 years. Then Paul has a third missionary journey, and it's on this journey that he spends a considerable amount of time in Ephesus, working in a kind of a tent-making ministry. Now, you will note on this map, we don't see the city known as Colossia, but if I remember correctly, it would be just a little bit west of Ephesus, probably right in this region here. I'm going to have to check that because I've been looking at a lot of maps lately. But it is not on the map, but we know that Paul established a church in Colossia, or there was a church established there that Paul purportedly wrote a letter to. It is that church, along with a church at Ephesus, that two of the letters that Paul wrote that are disputed have their source. The letter to the Ephesians and the letter to the Colossians. Also, a second letter to the Thessalonians is disputed as well. We don't think that Paul actually wrote them, but it was common at that time for these letters to be written in the name of Paul. And so Crossan and Borg are going to refer to this Paul as the conservative Paul. We see he's not quite as radical as he is in his authentic letters. And then finally, letters written to people that Paul knew comprise the so-called reactionary letters of Paul. And those are 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, purportedly people that knew him on his missionary journeys. And I think that's the end of my... but anyway, after these missionary journeys, the second missionary journey, 49 to 52, the third missionary, 53 to 58, Paul returns to Jerusalem and there causes such a ruckus that he is imprisoned. And he appeals to his Roman citizenship not to be brought before just the Jewish authorities as Jesus was. But Paul, because he's a Roman citizen, has the privilege of being tried by a Roman tribunal. And the last 4 or 5 chapters of Acts really document Paul's journey from going from one tribune to another and finally on to Rome, where he appeals to the emperor. Acts concludes with the story of Paul hoping eventually to make his way to Spain, right? Luke, we know that Luke is writing in 90, and by that time, Luke would have known that Paul had been martyred. But Luke wanted to make it appear as if he's writing prior to Paul's martyrdom and doesn't know that Paul would eventually be martyred. So Luke concludes with Paul in Rome, hoping eventually to go to Spain. But we know that there was an emperor by the name of Nero who came to the Roman throne, you will, and he thought of it as a throne. And and there ruled from 58 to 64, and just a horrendous time. You know the story about Nero purportedly starting a fire in Rome that allowed him to, enter upon all kinds of architectural projects that he wanted to complete, but he blamed the fire on the Christians. And it was then that the Christians came under grave persecution. Paul and Peter both were in Rome at this time, and we know that the tradition tells us that they met the fate of being, well, Paul was beheaded, which was a privilege. Peter would have had to suffer the execution for all non-Roman citizens, and that was the crucifixion. Peter, as the tradition goes, says he did not want to be crucified like Jesus, and thus wanted to be crucified upside down, which really interestingly, again, has to be taken with a grain of salt, because crucifixion works on the assumption that you're going to be crucified right side up. The weight of your body on your arms constricts your rib cage to remove the breath from you, and you die a very slow, suffocating death. Peter being crucified upside down would have completely undermined that whole process, but be that as it may. Paul, because he was a Roman citizen, had the privilege of being taken outside the city walls and there being beheaded. And here we have a 1370 rendition of that I wanted to show you. And all of these paintings of Paul usually show, a Roman soldier sheathing his sword with the head of Paul, removed from his body. But isn't it interesting that the nimbus, the gold, aura around Paul's head remains even on his decapitated head there. So that's a very brief overview with some questions of the life of Paul that I hope will serve as a foundation for our reading of Crossan and Borg's book. Any questions or comments?
Dan,
Danny? Yeah.
who recorded the beheading of St. Paul?
Not recorded anywhere. It's that I know of. This is just tradition. This is all oral tradition. Now, I doubt that there was anybody there at the time that said it happened on this date, but there is a place that commemorates this, and that's the Cathedral of St. Paul outside of the walls in Rome itself. It's purportedly built on the location where Paul was beheaded. Now, to answer your question more specifically, we could go to the early church fathers probably and find references to the beheading of Paul. But I don't know that we actually have a historical record of Paul being beheaded. I may be wrong on that. Does anybody know about this? I think it's the same with St. Peter as well.
And Dan, notice
Yeah.
the mask on the executioner. Very traditional practice, throughout Europe at that time. The mask that the executioner was wearing in that painting.
Oh, I didn't even notice that. So that looks like, in other words, the person who was being beheaded did not see that person's face as the last face before he died.
I mean,
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, come to think of it, every image I've seen of that, there's been an executioner wearing usually a leather mask with eyes and maybe a mouth place in it. So
because it transforms the executioner into an anonymous figure, so that when the execution is completed, then the mask comes off, or the hood, And nobody holds that executioner responsible, excuse me, responsible for that act.
Interesting. Interesting. Right. And thus absolving him of the guilt of that act.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
because that carried deep, deep, sorcery and spirits coming to get you, and yeah.
Right. Right. Oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Thank you. Any other comments or observations? I hope what we've talked about today wasn't too much of a review. It was nice for me to, we've been looking at Jesus so much in the Gospels. It was nice for me to just kind of remind myself of what I had once known and about Paul and his, his itinerary. There are certain mysteries about Paul. This conversion experience wasn't completely an internal mystical experience. And interestingly, Crossan and Borg are going to make the argument that Paul was how do they put it? A Jewish Christ mystic. Now, that I have read this book before, but you always read things from different perspectives. It will be interesting to see after our study of Spong, who did a lot of work in mysticism, how this pans out. I can understand where they might be coming from, and certainly there's a reference in 2 Corinthians of Paul, or of a man that Paul knows, a friend of his, being taken up into a third heaven, which really reflects on a mystical experience. But it will be nice in light of our just previous reading to look at that. Any other thoughts about appalling Paul? We know all the barbs that can be thrown at him, and Crossan and Borg say, hey, despite all of that, we like this guy, and don't confuse how the message was later interpreted with the person who wrote the message. And we're going to see, it's very important to remember that there are letters that it appears that Paul could have written. The context matches up at the time when he was alive. There are letters that may have been written by Paul, but probably not. Ephesians and Colossians, 2 Thessalonians. And there are definitely letters that reflect a context that is the early 2nd century that, just do not reflect, who Paul was prior to, the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era. Very Romanized letters, very, very conservative. I should use reactionary, meaning one who wants to hold fast to the status quo. And so that is going to be the lens through which we read Paul as we read this book. So I don't have my book with me. You can probably begin reading chapter 2 of Crossan's text, and we'll pick up with that chapter when we meet next time. Questions? Thank you for all showing up. I had a little scare with this microphone not working, and hopefully I can get it to work. So
It sounds good. It sounds good, Dan.
okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everyone. You know what? This is tentative. I have a search committee that meets next Wednesday, June 14. And it may be that I have afternoon hour off, but it all depends on when these search committee candidates are going to be with us. So please stay tuned for that, and I'll let you know as quickly as I can.